Growing up, I always felt like the shadow in my own family. My parents, Robert and Linda, were good people in the eyes of the world, but within the walls of our home, their favoritism was glaringly obvious. Chloe, my younger sister, was their golden child, and I was just there. From a young age, it became clear that I was expected to fend for myself while they showered Chloe with love, attention, and opportunities one could only dream of. It wasn't as if I didn't try. I worked hard in school, earned straight A's, and even took up extracurricular activities to catch their attention. But every accomplishment of mine was met with a lukewarm, "Good job, Michael," before they turned their focus back to Chloe. Meanwhile, her smallest victories, winning a participation ribbon in a school play or learning to play a basic tune on the piano, were celebrated with elaborate family dinners and gifts. By the time I hit my teenage years, I had grown accustomed to the indifference. Chloe was the star, the one destined for greatness, as my parents liked to remind everyone at every family gathering. I overheard them once, telling an uncle that Chloe had that spark, the kind of charm that would take her far, whereas I was described as reliable but unremarkable. It stung, but I buried those feelings and focused on my own life. At least I had Grandpa James. Grandpa James was my sanctuary. He saw me for who I was, not for what I wasn't. He would listen to my dreams, encourage my efforts, and remind me that I mattered. Every summer, I'd spend weeks at his countryside home, helping him with odd jobs and listening to his stories. He had a way of making me feel like the center of the universe, even if just for a little while. Chloe, on the other hand, rarely visited him. She found the countryside boring and Grandpa's stories too old-fashioned. But that didn't seem to bother my parents. As always, they excused her, saying she had more important things to focus on. When Grandpa passed away last year, it felt like losing a part of myself. He had been my anchor, the one person who believed in me without conditions. His funeral was small but emotional. Among his things, I discovered a handwritten will that he had shared with me during one of our summer talks. It stated that his modest estate, the house, a small savings account, and a collection of antique books, was to be divided equally between Chloe and me. It wasn't about the money, it was about the sentiment. Finally, something that recognized us both as equals. But my parents had other plans. One evening, as we gathered in the living room for the reading of the will, my parents announced their decision. They had decided that Chloe should inherit Grandpa's estate in its entirety. Their reasoning? Chloe had more use for it. She was starting her own business and could turn the property into a charming bed and breakfast. They looked at me, almost daring me to object, but I was too stunned to speak. My heart pounded as the weight of their words sank in. This wasn't just favoritism, it was outright dismissal of my place in the family. Grandpa's house wasn't just a property to me. It was a symbol of the bond we shared, the countless summers the first spent there, and the one place where I had always felt valued. And now, it was being handed over to Chloe as if I didn't exist. Chloe, predictably, was overjoyed. She hugged our parents, gushing about her plans for the house and how grateful she was for their support. She barely glanced in my direction, her excitement drowning out any thought of how I might feel. My parents beamed with pride, basking in the glow of her happiness, while I sat there, invisible yet again. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories of Grandpa James, his laughter, his wisdom, his unwavering belief in me, played in my mind like a bittersweet melody. I thought about confronting my parents, about demanding an explanation, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. They had made their choice long ago, and I was no match for their golden child. The next morning, as I walked past the living room, I overheard Chloe talking to our parents. She was discussing plans to renovate the house, mentioning how she'd have to get rid of that old junk Grandpa had left behind. My chest tightened at her words. To her, it was just a project, a stepping stone in her ambitious life plan. But to me, it was sacred ground. I couldn't let this go. Grandpa's legacy deserved more than to be stripped of its meaning and turned into a business venture. But how could I fight back without tearing what little was left of our family apart? As I stared at the morning light streaming through the window, I realized that this was no longer about the estate. It was about reclaiming my worth, not just in the eyes of my family, but in my own. The weeks following my parents' announcement were a blur of frustration and mounting tension. I tried to focus on work, on my own life, but the injustice gnawed at me like a persistent ache. The estate wasn't just property to me, it was a symbol of everything Grandpa James had stood for. The thought of Chloe's callous plans for the house made my blood boil. Yet, every time I replayed the scene in my mind, I could see the stubborn finality in my parents' expressions. They had made their decision, and they didn't expect me to challenge it. They should have known better. One evening, I decided to look deeper into the legal side of things. Grandpa James's will, which he had once shown me, was straightforward and explicit. His estate was to be divided equally between Chloe and me. But as I sifted through old family files, I stumbled upon something troubling. A document, unfinished, unsigned, drafted by my father, Robert. It proposed altering the will to grant Chloe full ownership of the property. The wording was careful but unmistakable. My heart raced as I realized what was happening. This wasn't just favoritism anymore, it was outright manipulation. The next morning, I confronted my parents. The atmosphere at breakfast was tense from the moment I entered the room. I brought up the document, choosing my words carefully, though my voice trembled with restrained anger. My father's response was infuriatingly dismissive. He explained that it was for Chloe's benefit, that she was, in a position to make the most of the estate. He even had the audacity to suggest that Grandpa James would have wanted it this way, despite the clear terms of the will. My mother, Linda, chimed in, her tone as placating as ever. She urged me to think of the family, to consider Chloe's future and how much potential she had. It felt like a carefully rehearsed script. My protests fell on deaf ears. They weren't interested in fairness or honoring Grandpa's wishes, they were determined to prop up Chloe at any cost. The argument escalated until my father finally declared the conversation over, leaving the table with a tone of finality that left no room for further discussion. For the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of their disregard. It wasn't just about Chloe being their favorite anymore. This was about erasing me entirely from a legacy that mattered deeply to me. The realization hit me hard, but it also lit a fire within me. If they thought I would simply accept this, they were wrong. Unsure of my next move, I decided to reach out to someone who had always been a voice of reason in our family, Grandma Eleanor, my late grandfather's wife. Eleanor was sharp and principled, and though she had often stayed neutral in family disputes, I knew she had no patience for dishonesty or manipulation. When I visited her, she greeted me warmly, her keen eyes immediately sensing that something was wrong. I explained the situation, starting with my parents' decision and ending with the discovery of the draft document. Her expression darkened as she listened, her hands gripping her teacup tightly. When I finished, she leaned back, silent for a moment, before speaking with quiet conviction. Grandpa James, she assured me, had been adamant about his wishes. He had spoken to her at length about the importance of fairness, especially given the dynamics within our family. His will was his way of ensuring that both Chloe and I were recognized equally, regardless of our parents' biases. The idea that my father would try to override those wishes clearly angered her. Eleanor's support was a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. She promised to stand by me, to ensure that Grandpa's will was honored. Her presence gave me the strength to keep fighting, but it also made me realize just how deep this battle might go. My parents' willingness to rewrite the past for Chloe's benefit was a betrayal that cut deeper than I cared to admit. As I left Eleanor's house that evening, a new resolve took root within me. This wasn't just about the estate anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for the bond one had shared with Grandpa James, and for the principle of fairness that he had always championed. My parents had underestimated me, but they were about to learn that I wouldn't back down so easily. The following days were tense. I avoided unnecessary interactions with my parents, focusing instead on gathering evidence and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Meanwhile, Chloe carried on as if nothing was amiss, blissfully unaware or indifferent to the turmoil her privilege had caused. Her excitement over the estate, her estate, as she now referred to it, only fueled my determination. Eleanor, true to her word, began reaching out to family members and legal contacts, quietly building a case to ensure that Grandpa's will would be respected. Her involvement brought me a sense of validation I hadn't felt in years. For once, someone in the family was on my side, and it gave me the courage to keep pushing forward. But the deeper I dug, the more unsettling the truth became. My parents' favoritism was no longer just an emotional wound, it had become a calculated effort to diminish my place in the family. As I prepared to challenge them, I couldn't shake the feeling that this fight would have consequences far beyond the estate. The stakes were higher than I had anticipated, and I knew that the road ahead would test me in ways I wasn't yet prepared for. The more I worked with Grandma Eleanor, the more the pieces of my family's tangled web began to unravel. As we reviewed Grandpa James's old letters and personal notes, she revealed something that made my stomach turn. Years ago, before Grandpa's health started to decline, Robert and Linda had already tried to pressure him into changing his will. They had argued that Chloe's future would be brighter with the full inheritance, while I would find my way on my own, a backhanded compliment disguised as practicality. Grandpa, in his characteristic firm but kind way, had refused. Eleanor recounted these moments with a mixture of sadness and anger. She remembered how Grandpa had confided in her, saying he was determined to be fair to both of us, no matter how much resistance he faced from my parents. His resolve had been unshakable, and yet here we were, fighting the same battle he had tried to prevent. The realization lit a fire in both of us. This wasn't just my fight, it was about honoring Grandpa James and the values he had lived by. With Eleanor's support, the next steps became clear. She reached out to her lawyer, a meticulous and sharp-witted man named Mr. Harrington, who agreed to help ensure the will was upheld. He started by filing a formal notice with the probate court, freezing any changes to the estate until the situation could be reviewed. This move sent immediate shockwaves through the family. It was no longer a quiet dispute behind closed doors, the battle lines were drawn. The tension didn't take long to ripple outward. Family members who had previously stayed neutral began to take sides. Some, like Aunt Margaret and Cousin Daniel, voiced their support for me, appalled by the lengths Robert and Linda had gone to manipulate the inheritance. Margaret, who had always been close to Grandpa, shared her own memories of him talking about the importance of fairness. She described him as a man of principle, someone who would have never condoned such blatant favoritism. On the other hand, there were those who saw me as the troublemaker. Uncle Frank, my father's younger brother, accused me of being ungrateful and stirring up unnecessary conflict. He argued that Chloe's success was a reflection of her hard work and ambition, and that I should step aside for the greater good. His words stung, but I couldn't help but notice how they echoed the same script my parents had been using all along. Amid the growing division, Chloe remained curiously detached. She seemed to revel in the attention, playing the role of the innocent victim caught in the middle. Her casual indifference to the family's growing discord only deepened my resolve. It wasn't just about the estate anymore, it was about exposing the truth and putting an end to the narrative that had cast me as the perpetual outsider. Eleanor, in her quiet but relentless way, began gathering allies. She reached out to other relatives who had known Grandpa James well, sharing her perspective and reminding them of the man he was. She also unearthed old family photographs and letters, using them to build a case that this wasn't just a legal issue but a moral one. Her determination was inspiring, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda's frustration became increasingly apparent. They accused Eleanor of meddling, claiming she was being unfair to Chloe. Their arguments grew more heated, their defenses more desperate. It was clear they hadn't expected this level of resistance, and they were struggling to maintain control of the narrative. What surprised me most was the effect this conflict had on other members of the family. The tension forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases and assumptions. Those who had always seen my parents as the perfect couple began to question their motivations. Conversations that had once been filled with light-hearted anecdotes were now charged with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, each one more strained than the last. Despite the chaos, I felt a growing sense of empowerment. Eleanor's unwavering support and the solidarity of other relatives reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. Every piece of evidence we uncovered, every ally we gained, strengthened my resolve to see this through. The truth was on my side, and I was determined to make it known. Then came a pivotal moment. Eleanor found a letter, tucked away in one of Grandpa's old journals, addressed to me. In it, he wrote about his hopes for the future and his belief in my potential. He spoke of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. It was as if Grandpa was speaking to me from beyond the grave, giving me the courage I needed to keep fighting. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on my parents grew. The legal proceedings had stalled their plans, and the mounting family backlash left them increasingly isolated. Chloe, for all her charm and ambition, began to lose the unwavering support she had always taken for granted. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Through it all, Eleanor remained my rock. Her quiet strength and unwavering belief in justice kept me grounded, even when the odds felt stacked against me. Together, we were determined to honor Grandpa James's legacy and ensure that his final wishes were respected. This was more than just a fight for an inheritance, it was a fight for the values he had instilled in us, and for the future he had envisioned for our family. The tide finally began to turn when Robert was stripped of his position as executor of Grandpa James's will. It had been a hard-fought battle, but the evidence Eleanor and I had gathered was undeniable. The court's decision marked a turning point, affirming Grandpa's original wishes and ensuring that his estate would be divided equally. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of victory, but it came with a storm I hadn't fully anticipated. When the news broke, my father's reaction was explosive. He confronted me in the living room, his voice filled with a fury I'd never seen before. Though he didn't shout, his words were sharp, slicing through any pretense of civility. He accused me of tearing the family apart, of betraying him and Linda after everything they had done for me. The weight of his anger was palpable, and for a moment, I struggled to respond. His words were laced with disappointment, as if I had committed an unforgivable act. But I didn't back down. Years of being sidelined, dismissed, and overlooked had built a resilience within me that even his accusations couldn't shake. I reminded myself that this wasn't about greed or revenge, it was about justice and respect. If he couldn't see that, it wasn't my burden to carry. Linda, meanwhile, played a different game. She tried to appeal to my emotions, her voice trembling as she spoke about the family's long-standing unity and the pain my actions were causing. Her words were calculated, designed to make me doubt myself and feel guilty for standing my ground. She brought up memories from my childhood, carefully curated to paint a picture of sacrifice and love, conveniently omitting the countless moments of favoritism and neglect. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, but I saw through it. Despite their efforts, the truth was out in the open, and there was no going back. The court's decision had shifted the dynamics within the family, forcing everyone to confront the underlying tensions that had been festering for years. Some relatives, like Aunt Margaret and Cousin Daniel, openly supported me, while others distanced themselves, unwilling to take sides in what they saw as a family dispute. The division was stark, and the air at family gatherings grew colder with each passing day. What I hadn't expected was Chloe's reaction. At first, she seemed unaffected by the fallout, continuing with her plans for the estate as if nothing had changed. But as the weeks went by, I noticed subtle shifts in her demeanor. Her confidence, once so unshakable, began to waver. She grew quieter during family discussions, her usual charm replaced by an uncharacteristic unease. One evening, as I was leaving our parents' house, Chloe stopped me on the porch. For the first time in what felt like forever, she looked at me not as the overlooked older brother but as an equal. She admitted that the court's decision had made her question everything: our parents' motivations, her own entitlement, and the impact their favoritism had on her life. She spoke about the pressure of being the perfect child, of always living up to their expectations, and how it had left her feeling dependent and unfulfilled. Her words caught me off guard. I had spent so long resenting her that I hadn't stopped to consider how our parents' favoritism had shaped her, too. It didn't excuse her indifference or the privilege she had so readily embraced, but it added a layer of complexity to the narrative. She wasn't just the golden child, she was also a victim of their manipulations, trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. The conversation was brief, but it planted a seed of understanding between us. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of the sister I'd always hoped to have, someone who could recognize the pain our parents' actions had caused and who might, one day, stand beside me in challenging the status quo. But the battle with Robert and Linda was far from over. Their anger festered, manifesting in subtle jabs and passive-aggressive remarks at every opportunity. They painted me as the villain to anyone who would listen, framing my actions as selfish and destructive. The weight of their disapproval was heavy, but it was a burden I was willing to bear if it meant honoring Grandpa James's legacy. Eleanor, ever the pillar of strength, reminded me to stay focused. She spoke about the importance of breaking cycles, of challenging the patterns that had defined our family for so long. Her words were a source of comfort, grounding me in moments of doubt. Together, we continued to push forward, determined to see this fight through to the end. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in our family's facade grew wider. Chloe's growing self-awareness brought unexpected changes, shifting the dynamics further. She began questioning our parents openly, challenging their decisions in ways that left them visibly unsettled. Her transformation was slow but significant, and it gave me hope that change, however painful, was possible. The conflict reached its peak during a family gathering. Robert, unable to contain his frustration, confronted me in front of everyone, accusing me of prioritizing my pride over the family's well-being. His words were sharp, but this time, they didn't cut as deeply. I had found my voice, and I used it to remind him of the values Grandpa James had instilled in us. I spoke about fairness, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Linda tried to intervene, her voice trembling with emotion, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The support of Eleanor, Chloe's growing awareness, and the court's decision had shifted the balance. For the first time, Robert and Linda seemed to realize that their grip on the narrative was slipping. The facade they had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and there was no hiding from the truth anymore. As I stood there, surrounded by the remnants of a fractured family, I felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about an inheritance or a legal battle, it was about redefining what it meant to be a family. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: I was no longer the silent, overlooked son. I had found my voice, and I wasn't afraid to use it. The weeks that followed the court's final decision were a whirlwind of emotions. Chloe's transformation from a seemingly oblivious beneficiary of favoritism to someone capable of self-reflection was one of the most unexpected turns. She approached me one evening, visibly nervous, and apologized for her role in the family dynamics. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was genuine. She admitted that she had started to see how much she had taken for granted and how our parents' treatment of me had shaped both our lives in ways she hadn't fully understood. What struck me most wasn't just her apology but what she said next. Chloe had decided to use her share of Grandpa's inheritance to pursue something meaningful. After years of being groomed as the golden child, living up to expectations that weren't her own, she wanted a fresh start. She planned to enroll in college to study social work, inspired by the very struggle that had divided our family. Her words carried a weight that I hadn't expected, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of mutual respect growing between us. Meanwhile, Eleanor's quiet resolve to address the deeper issues within our family took center stage. She organized a gathering at her house, inviting not just immediate family members but also those who had taken sides during the conflict. The purpose of the meeting was clear: to air out the grievances that had long been swept under the rug and to confront the favoritism that had defined our family's history. Eleanor began by sharing stories about Grandpa James, painting a picture of a man who valued fairness and integrity above all else. She spoke about his love for both Chloe and me, emphasizing that his will wasn't just a legal document but a reflection of his principles. Then she addressed the broader issue: how favoritism had not only hurt me but had also placed an unfair burden on Chloe, trapping her in a role that left little room for personal growth or independence. The conversation was raw and emotional. Relatives who had remained neutral during the conflict finally spoke up, acknowledging the patterns of favoritism they had observed over the years. Some admitted their own biases, while others apologized for their silence. The atmosphere was tense but cathartic, as decades of unspoken truths were brought to light. Robert and Linda's reactions were mixed. Linda, who had relied on emotional manipulation for so long, seemed visibly shaken by the collective acknowledgement of her role in perpetuating the imbalance. Robert, on the other hand, struggled to let go of his narrative. He clung to the idea that his decisions had always been in the family's best interest, but his arguments were met with quiet resistance from those who had once supported him. For me, the meeting was a turning point. It wasn't just about vindication, it was about finding a path forward. As I listened to Eleanor and the others, I realized that my fight had never been about winning or proving a point. It was about reclaiming my place in the family and ensuring that the cycles of favoritism and resentment didn't continue. Chloe's actions in the aftermath of the meeting further solidified our growing bond. She began reaching out more, not just to me but to other relatives as well, seeking to rebuild relationships that had been strained by years of division. She spoke openly about her plans for the future and how she hoped to use her experiences to help others navigate similar challenges. Her sincerity was a stark contrast to the indifference she had once shown, and it gave me hope that real change was possible. As for Robert and Linda, their journey toward understanding and accountability was far slower. They continued to grapple with the loss of control over the family narrative, but the cracks in their facade were undeniable. I made it clear to them that while I was willing to maintain a relationship, it would be on my terms. Setting boundaries was a new experience for me, but it was one of the most empowering steps I'd taken. Eleanor remained a constant source of support, her wisdom guiding me through the complexities of rebuilding relationships while maintaining my own sense of self-worth. She reminded me that progress wasn't linear and that healing would take time, but the fact that conversations were happening at all was a sign of growth. As the months passed, I began to focus on my own path. The inheritance, once a source of contention, became a tool for self-improvement and growth. I invested in my education, pursued new opportunities, and started building a life that felt authentically mine. The lessons I had learned from the conflict, about resilience, fairness, and the importance of standing up for oneself, shaped my decisions and gave me a sense of purpose. Looking back, the journey had been far from easy. The pain of confronting long-held family dynamics, the weight of accusations and misunderstandings, and the struggle to find my voice had all taken their toll. But through it all, I had discovered something invaluable, a sense of self that was no longer defined by the opinions or expectations of others. As I stood on the porch of Eleanor's house one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. With Eleanor's unwavering support, Chloe's newfound resolve, and my own hard-won clarity, I knew that the legacy Grandpa James had left behind wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about the values he had instilled in us and the strength to carry them forward, no matter how difficult the journey might be.